Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Radium and today I have a kind of unique video for all of you in which we're going to be playing different really difficult bosses from various content mods in Terraria, and it's going to be a really good time I believe, because my main intention with this series as a whole, or this individual episode, is going to be discussing difficulty and figuring out how it truly impacts gameplay for this. The reason I'm showing a Moonlord fight as I do the introduction, as showing this battle will allow us to use this as sort of a placeholder that we can base all of the other bosses around, because this fight is fairly, well, I'd say fairly average in terms of difficulty once you get the hang of it. It's a fight that's difficult at first but becomes exponentially easier the more you understand it. There are definitely ways of manipulating the AI to make it so much easier, and overall it's a fight that any good player could do with decent consistency. But at the same time, there is enough there to keep it somewhat inconsistent, so no one can do it 100% of the time. As of such, if this was to be placed in a difficulty scale, I'd say this is a very middle of the road, like 5 out of 10 in terms of difficulty, just because there's not really enough going on to be too complex. Additionally, other factors like the items you are using at that stage will be taken into account. For example, I will not be expected to use like Moonlord tier items for insanely difficult bosses like Supreme Calamitous and such. Instead, I will be allowed to use whatever gear is provided by the mod and recommended by my friends. The main reason behind that is I have not experienced many of these mods, but I've been told that they were incredibly difficult fights, and overall I just wanted to check them out and give them a relatively balanced rating. With all of that said, however, let us get into the video. The first boss we have in this entire thing is the Dream Eater. Now this is from Thorium, a mod I've actually played a few times, and I'm happy to say they've changed the mod up for the better. This used to be a very bland fight that was sort of unbalanced and really simple at the same time, and it was just kind of bizarre, but now the AI works very differently. There are 2 unique phases to the fight as always, but instead you can only attack one of the 3 guardians at the same time, in which their AIs have different attacks and different phases as their health depletes, which they get more difficult at. This phase sort of serves as a warm-up for what's to come, because the second phase is pretty much all 3 of these combined, and it just really prepares you for that, so it's not too bad. Honestly, this took me like 3 tries or so to do, and once I did that then it was fairly easy. One thing I will say about this fight, however, is that it's very forgiving. A lot of these attacks aren't strong in a way that will catch you into several hits, and normally if you get hit it'll happen and then you'll be able to get back into a pattern fairly easily, and then you can just continue on with the fight, regenerate your health, and act like nothing happened. That is a factor that does make this fight a lot easier actually, because getting hit is one thing, but being able to recover is much more important. The Dream Eater itself combines attacks from the 3 guardians you fought in the last phase, and is significantly harder as opposed to the last phase, but luckily for us, the attacks are very well choreographed. As you can see from that one, the first beams don't actually hurt you when they vertically drop. And yeah, everything that comes towards you is choreographed to the point where you have a good second to react. Additionally, this fight is fairly quick. It's definitely on the longer side compared to some of the bosses in this, but again, it's kind of middle of the road in terms of length, because, you know, modded fights can take up to 10 minutes in some cases. There are certainly classes that do better than others against this boss. For example, I cannot imagine that doing this with Summoner in 1.3 would be very fun, mainly because your best weapon is still only the Stardust Dragon, which is subpar at this stage when compared with like the Last Prism, the SDMG, and even like the Terrarian and such would do great against this fight. However, since the battle's easy enough, you do get away with it, and as of such, I'm going to be rating this boss at a 6 out of 10. It's definitely harder than something like the Moonlord, but it's very easy to learn, there's not too much going on, and it serves as a great final conclusion to Thorium. The next boss we're looking at is from the Spirit mod. This is the Overseer. Now, this is a difficult fight in a very different way. Now, we just witnessed a boss that is difficult because it's consistent, but the attacks are variable and somewhat sporadic. Now this boss is an absolute nightmare on the other hand. He's not too difficult, the attacks are absolutely fine in most cases, but the boss is so unrelenting, his attacks are randomized to some extent, as in the order the attacks come, although they are very limited, and if you get hit by the wrong attacks, they will wipe out most of your health bar in a single blow. So this fight is more inconsistent than difficult, which is another form of difficulty completely. Again, I would say this is significantly harder than the Thorium bosses, but it's for a very different reason. The fact that this fight gets points for being cheap and unfair is kind of upsetting, but it is still logistically harder than a lot of other bosses, mainly because of that. Despite all of those factors, once you get a lucky run, you do absolutely destroy this boss, and so it can't be too highly praised in terms of difficulty. And there are definitely certain things you can do to nullify the effects of most of the dangerous attacks, and the Rod of Discord and the Slimy Saddle, two of the best items for this fight, honestly. You don't even need a pair of wings if you're smart with those, but I would definitely recommend it anyways. One thing I should mention for this fight, however, it does a fairly good job at eliminating some of the more overpowered options. For example, the last Prism in the Spirit mod receives a significant damage reduction against this boss, I found, and it was only achieving about 3000 DPS, which is worse than the SDMG. So the Lunar Flare is a more viable option for this battle, and that's a good thing because it stops weapons from being too overpowered, and makes everything a little more fair. The next boss we're going to be looking at is Nebulous from Mod of Redemption. This is a very bizarre fight with a lot going on, various phases, and it is incredibly rapid, and just the fight is a nightmare to do for your first time. But once you get the pattern down, then the fight becomes increasingly easy. As said, this is a fight that gets much easier with experience, and this is mainly because the attacks are actually choreographed with these massive words above the boss's head. This doesn't make it necessarily easy to dodge, but it definitely gives you the warning to get into the right position before the attacks start coming in, and just allows you to prepare for the worst. One thing this boss does really well as a comparison to others is it gets gradually more difficult throughout the entire battle, and despite being a relatively lengthy fight, even with the best gear the Mod of Redemption has to offer, it's a very good fun one, and I mean, it's definitely more long than difficult, because a lot of the attacks aren't aggressive enough to kill you. In that sense, it has the same forgiveness factor that some of the Thorium bosses have, in the sense that even if you get hit for a lot of damage, you can most likely recover before you get hit again, and so it doesn't even matter if you got hit at all. As opposed to the previous two fights, I'd say that every single class in Mod of Redemption is fairly good against this boss, just because of how the mod is laid out, and that's a great thing because it means that all the classes are equally balanced, and no player is at a disadvantage when doing this fight. Even Summoner, which are given a Sentry Summon. From experience, I can tell you that still somehow works just fine. The fact that throughout the fight some of the same attacks get empowered and slightly more difficult is a very good way of introducing new attacks without overwhelming the player. And it's definitely a balanced fight. I wouldn't say it's overly difficult, mainly just because everything's choreographed and you can see where everything's coming. But it's still great fun to do. I absolutely adore this fight, and I'm putting it at a 6 out of 10, same as the Overseer. The next thing we're looking at are the lost siblings from Shadows of Abaddon. Now surprisingly, this is not the final boss of Shadows of Abaddon, and most of the bosses in this video are the final boss of each respective mod. Mainly because obviously progression is supposed to be linear and exponential, but however, I'd honestly say that from experience, I tried both the final boss of this mod, which is Nihilus, and these seem to definitely be harder. I managed to beat both the fights without dying, but this one amounted me a lot more problems, and so I'm putting this instead of that boss, if that makes sense. This boss provides a wide variety of different attacks from 4 unique enemies, all of which have a ton of health, and despite having great gear for this fight, it's still incredibly difficult and you can get caught in strings of attacks very easily. One piece of advice I would give is try not to get overwhelmed by the first phase, because again, running in one direction is normally enough to separate them or like line them all up so you can do massive damage with weapons with penetration, and it makes the first phase a whole lot easier, especially once you start eliminating some of the siblings, as the attacks do not severify once some of them are defeated. It's kind of similar in the way that you should fight Skeletron Prime. Eliminating singular arms will make the rest of the fight easier, and once you can focus them, it becomes a lot more manageable. However, that's not where the fight ends. After all 4 are defeated, Nathaniel will spawn, which is a very different fight. This operates kind of differently, and initially this does actually seem relatively easy. The attacks are very well choreographed. Despite this being my first ever try, I still knew somehow how to dodge most of them, and it's a very quick, intuitive battle that tells you everything you need to know. That's the case until the second phase, that is, because a lot of the attacks become a lot more subtle, I guess you could call it. Again, they do a lot of damage for this kind of phase, and like new player will have no experience with this, and so they will just get overwhelmed very quickly and most likely die their first time around. The saving grace of this battle is the weapons you have available at this stage. A lot of these weapons are stronger than Moonlord gear, and so you can dish out a good amount of damage, and potentially you can out DPS the boss even if you don't have a great understanding, which is why I will not give this boss a very high rankings, but still, it's definitely harder than the ones we've seen thus far, and for this video I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 difficulty. The next boss we're looking at is Erebus from the Ultranium mod. Now this is a very, very different fight in terms of what we've been looking at. Now these previous bosses have been incredibly difficult due to their attacks being choreographed but still difficult to dodge. This boss is the absolute opposite. Its attacks are actually very simplistic in terms of evading them. But what makes this fight difficult is how badly choreographed they are. First of all, your entire world is plunged into darkness because you need to do an event before you can even begin this fight, and that makes it an absolute nightmare to deal with. Again, there are some very good weapons you can use that absolutely annihilate the boss, but the fact is you are going to get hit a few times unless you really know what you're doing here. As far as I understand, the boss has 3 unique phases. I may be wrong with that. The first one going from 100% health to 50%. Then he summons these weird orbs around his head, and then the final phase he kind of spins around you in a frantic enragement, and that's pretty much where the fight comes to a close. There's not a lot going on, but for some reason this fight is incredibly difficult. As said, the attacks aren't actually too hard to dodge, and they should be easy for a player who has a basic understanding of the mod. And this fight actually did kill me a couple of times, surprise, surprise. So, despite a lot of these other bosses not really amounting to be too much challenge, this was the first one that killed me a good few times before I got the basic swing of things. Additionally, this weapon is biased towards homing weapons because they definitely have their utilities here. So classes like Mage would struggle if they don't have a good homing weapon at this phase, although I cannot confirm that to be the case since I don't have enough experience with this mod. This is what I mean by various different means of difficulty, by the way. As in, there is no one definition for a term like this, and that's why a video like this is so hard to construct. It's very hard to give balanced opinions on something like this as well, mainly because I don't have the knowledge that other people who play the mod more than me has. But at the same time, I hope my opinion still classifies valid, and I mean, yeah, overall this is a very difficult fight, and another 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. The next boss is Shen Doragon, and I'm fighting the Awakened variant. I believe this is from Ancients Awakened, but I don't remember the actual mod name for some reason. Now, this is a very challenging fight in some senses, and on the surface this honestly looks like one of the most challenging fights you could do, maybe looking at like one of the harder fights, maybe even pushing up towards Calamity difficulty. However, something really bizarre about this entire battle is the gear you have at this stage. The gear you are provided with in this battle is incredibly powerful. I mean, like literally strong enough to kill the boss in a matter of moments. And it kind of removes the skill factor because, quite frankly, you don't need to be good at the game to do this. And so this fight is actually really easy. This was my first ever proper try, where I was using this kind of loadout that wasn't, you know, completely ruined by vanilla stuff. And yeah, even though I didn't do the boss well, I managed to win. And that's something really bizarre. Again, the attacks should be really difficult to dodge, but you can legitimately out DPS the boss with these kind of weapons, and unless it's an overlook by the developers, this mod is heavily unbalanced. How could we go for an entire one of these videos without talking about Calamity at least a little bit? And the obvious pick for this list is Supreme Calamitous. Now, I'm going to be looking at the Death Mode variant, although the other two still mostly apply in terms of their difficulty, being like Normal, Expert, and Revengeance mode. Now, the thing that makes this fight hard is the amount of phases it does, and the lack of forgiveness throughout it. Even with the Yorick Tesla armor, which is absolutely amazing, and pretty much mandatory for this fight unless you're a god beyond gods, yeah, it's just so hard to get consistent at. The lack of forgiveness comes from the attacks that, no matter how much defense you have, do hundreds of damage every single hit, and so you need various different regenerative buffs to help you compensate for that. The fight is actually split into 3 unique segments as far as I understand, but each of those segments has various different, like, sub-stages, I guess you could call them. The first phase of the fight consists of an introduction, these various orbs with a sepulture, which is a massive worm, and the boss is completely invincible until you destroy all of the floating orbs. Now at half health, the next phase activates. The invincibility intervals don't actually count as their own phases unless the music switches, and that's just something to keep in mind. From 50% to 30%, the next phase is in play. This is where the boss summons the siblings. Again, they are Catastrophe and Cataclysm. Now these two are very difficult now, as opposed to how they were before. The AI is very different and just very difficult to counter overall. And it means that this phase is no longer a break and you can't really rely on regenerating during this battle anymore. The last phase is kind of a frantic rush of various different things, like a massive ring of smaller enemies that you need to kill to continue damaging the boss, another round of the sepulchres, and these giant red orbs that float around the arena for the remainder of the fight. All of these factors add up very quickly, and in the confined arena, you very quickly get overwhelmed. And this fight is honestly one of the hardest bosses in Modded. I'm going to have to say, however, it's nowhere near the hardest, just because of different experiences I've had with this. And overall, there are just definitely more challenging bosses out there. Despite all this, I do honestly think this is one of the best fights in all of Modded Terraria. It's just amazing, the amount of effort that goes into it. The song, well, the theme was obviously amazing, made by Kuro, and everything about it is just so aesthetically beautiful, in a very, very bizarre way. Overall, I'm going to be giving Supreme Calamitous a 9 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. A fight that takes beyond, like, skill, and it takes dedication to beat. You may be thinking that's honestly as hard as it gets, but believe it or not, there is a tier above that kind of boss. Now, I may be missing some things, which is actually very probable, because I'm somewhat disorganized when making this video, but how could we not forget about Fargo's mod? Now, there are 3 unique bosses that come with Fargo's mod. The Deviant, the Abomination, and the Mutant. All 3 of these are strong contenders for this list, and in fact, any Eternity mode boss could theoretically be on this list as well. But I've decided that I'm going with the Mutant. I feel like that's a fair enough pick for this video. And, I mean, he's pretty much the pinnacle of difficulty summed up in Terraria. Insane attacks, unpredictability, inconsistency as well, and there is pretty much no forgiveness to be seen. If you get caught in a string of hits, you are not recovering, your run is over and you are dead. Additionally, believe it or not, this fight has recently received an update that somehow makes it harder. I'm definitely not looking forward to fighting this boss in my livestream series, because I've only beaten it once before, and it was an absolute nightmare. And yeah, it's just beyond difficult. The only thing I would say is that the weapons and gear you are given at this stage, not necessarily the armor, because you are expected to use Moonlord armor at this stage, but in terms of like the stuff altogether, you're given amazing weapons like the Blender, the Leash of Cthulhu, the Omniscient Staff I believe it's called, which is a summon weapon, and you are given the most amazing accessories in the entire game, which do definitely compensate, but those factors alone make this fight so difficult still, and they don't really change too much. Due to the recent buffs this boss has received, it's even more unbearable than before, and I'm actually terrified to fight this boss properly now. This was my first run, after multiple months of not doing it, and somehow I managed to get the boss quite low down. I don't actually defeat it in this presentation just because the fight's way too long and I did die, but I feel like that very much sums up how this fight is overall. So here we are, our undisputed champion of the hardest boss in Terraria, right? Well, actually, it's not that easy. There is one more contender for a boss that I think definitely deserves the spot above this, and I'm going to be showing you why. The final boss we're going to be looking at, and the undisputed most difficult fight in all of Terraria, is Blushy Magic. Now this fight is ridiculous. I'm not even going to try and attempt it. I had like 5 goes and just died instantaneously, even using like mutant gear because I didn't want to seriously give it a go. But after some exploration and some recommendations from my friends, I feel like, regardless of our opinions on the different bosses, this was one thing that we could all manage to agree on. That this fight was the hardest thing in all of Terraria. Just absolutely 100%. There's nothing that really compares to it. Its difficulty comes in a new way, however, which is why I'm not going to be going in depth to it. It's the equivalent of playing a really hard Undertale fan game with Terraria as its engine. And it is really good fun. I did actually have a good few tries with it, like now, but it's still just out of the question for me. I don't intend on beating this boss, and in terms of difficulty, it's incomprehensible. I can't get this thing a ranking, but all I do know is that it's 100% the hardest boss in all of Terraria. With that said, that's going to round off the video. Now, I'm really sorry if this one's not organised too well. Quite frankly, I really don't know how this is going to come out, and it could come out terribly if I'm not good with the editing. But regardless, I do hope you enjoy. With that all said, however, thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, I will see all of you in the next one. Peace out, guys.